Is this a good volume for everybody? Everybody can hear me in the back? Okay, cool. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Matt. I'm a former member of the Flutter team at Google. I was there on the Flutter team from 2018 to 2020. And then I left to go do my own thing, which has included YouTube video education, corporate training, consulting, contract development, open source development, all of it. And tonight, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some real world Flutter. There's lots of blog posts out there, Stack Overflow questions, videos that go over all this basic stuff, how to create a list of things, whether it's a settings screen or a social feed or this or that. But these kind of go through the same handful of problems over and over again. And what we don't talk about is what does it look like to solve a non-solved problem in Flutter. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about tonight. I'm sorry, we should probably start in the first slide instead of the last, huh? Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about PDF displays in Flutter. So my team is working for a client that wants to build this world-class PDF reading experience. And let's just talk briefly about what that means. It means obviously we have a PDF, but on top of that PDF, we want to be able to take handwritten notes. We want to be able to highlight content and save those highlights for later. We want to select text to copy it. We want to link between docs. This is all kind of a world-class reading experience. But of course, all of that is pointless if you can't actually show the PDF underneath all those cool features. And that's the problem that we were interested in investigating. So I'm going to give you a good way to approach any problem that you try to solve with Flutter or even Dart. First, go check Pub, see if there's already something that someone else has built which solves your problem. If you can configure it to do what you need to do, then you should go ahead and use it and then invest your time and energy in things that people haven't solved yet. So go check Pub. Don't be afraid to use things from Pub. Make that a tool for you and your team and your company. However, you also don't want to skimp on the quality of your experience. So if you go to Pub and you can't find anything that really does what you're trying to ship to your customers, you shouldn't feel compelled to downgrade your experience. At that point, you need to build it yourself. And if you're going to build something yourself, then you can do it in 3 phases. First, you make it work, then you make it fast, and then you make it polished. And at a high level, we're going to go through these phases here tonight when it comes to PDF rendering. So let's talk about building a great Flutter PDF viewer. We're going to tear out all those features related to highlights and linking. We're just going to talk about the PDF. How do we make a great PDF viewer? Well, like I said, the first place we go is Pub. Are there any Flutter PDF plugins on Pub? And there sure are. There's a seeming endless list of plugins, PDF plugins available on Pub. But then the question becomes, do any of them do what we need them to do? Well, we scoured this list. We looked at dozens and dozens and dozens of plugins. And at a really high level, we can divide it into 2 groups, paid and free. And let's talk about each of those groups. On the paid plugin side, there are a couple of companies, in this case, for example, PDFtron and Syncfusion. These are major PDF document companies. They specialize in this stuff, not specifically for Flutter, but for any technology. They really focus on the domain of PDFs and documents. However, there were 2 things we'd like to avoid here. One is that my client is a brand new startup. They would like to avoid permanent, perpetual, recurring fees for the ability to display PDFs. But second, and perhaps more important, is that these very polished, performant experiences, they are wonderful experiences for what they are, but they aren't made to be heavily customized. They're kind of these drop-in user experiences, user interfaces, and they give you what you get what they give you, and that's it. Since we are trying to come up with new ways of actually reading and interacting with PDF documents, we can't just use somebody else's experience. We need full control, and we couldn't get it from either of these. So that then brings us to the free plugins. We looked at dozens of free plugins, and we found that they pretty much all work the same way. They just have minor differences. So we found what we thought was probably the highest quality free PDF viewing plugin, and we tried to see, will this work for us? Does it have the performance characteristics that we need? Is it customizable? Let me show you just a couple real short videos of interacting with that plugin. The first one here, and it's going to be a little tough to see this probably on the screen in front of you, but we're testing the physics of flinging the pages. So it might sound like a small issue for developers, this issue of what's the momentum like when you release on a scroll. But if you're building a premium reading experience, the reader is going to do this constantly all the time. So it's actually critical that it feels like a premium momentum scrolling experience. What we found here was that pretty much no matter how hard we fling, the pages seem to pretty rapidly come to a stop. At the end of the momentum, they kind of jerk to a stop. And there were certain moments where we would fling and literally the whole thing would lock up, probably due to layout jank. But we also can't ship that to our customers either. That's not a premium reading experience. But we have an even bigger problem here with this plugin, which is what happens when we start zooming in and panning around. And what you're going to see is that no matter where we're panning from and where we're panning to, we're constantly facing blurry content. This here absolutely cannot be shipped as a serious reading experience. It may be passable if you're like reviewing an end user license agreement on some random page in an app, but this is not going to work as the core experience for a reading app. And so if this is the best that Pub has to offer among the free plugins that are somewhat customizable, clearly we're going to have to build our own. And that's what we did. So what does it mean to display a PDF in Flutter? At this moment right now, it is not possible to literally paint PDF content in Flutter. And that's a deep discussion for another day. But what that means is every PDF viewer that you see in Flutter works like this. The Flutter code, whether it's an app or it's a package, it sends a message over to the platform. And for simplicity, we're just going to focus on Android. Sends a message to Android and says, hey, would you please render this page of the PDF to an image and then send that image back to Flutter in some way, and we're going to show the image of the PDF page. That's how a PDF viewer works in Flutter. So that's what we're going to build. So phase one of build it yourself is make it work. How can we render a PDF page to an image and display it in Flutter? I'm going to go through this at a high level with you now. First, we have to render to a bitmap. That is the image we're working with. That's step one. Fortunately, Android makes that pretty easy for us. The Android SDK actually ships with a PDF renderer. So we can create this page object from a document. We can create a new bitmap, tell it what size we want the bitmap to be, and then we ask the page to render to the bitmap. And with this little snippet of code, we already have an image. You can, if you're not real familiar with working with bitmaps, think PNG, think JPEG. We have a bitmap image with the view of a PDF page ready to go. Now, the next thing we're going to do is where we begin to diverge from a lot of these existing plugins. The existing plugins often take the entire bitmap and send it from Android back into Dart and Flutterland, literally copying all the pixel values. And we're talking about images that can easily be 15 megabytes each. So that's being shoved across this, what's called the platform channel, sometimes multiple times per frame, which is a huge waste of memory and CPU usage. And also, once you get back to the Flutter side, you then have to upload it into the Flutter engine to be displayed. You need to decode the image, and all of that's unnecessary. Some other plugins actually write the image to a file from the Android side, and then they read the file from the Flutter side. Similarly, a huge waste of time. And so that's why some of those plugins have performance bottlenecks that you just can't avoid. But what we can actually do on the Android side is we can copy that bitmap into a GPU texture. And Flutter is actually capable of displaying that texture in your widget tree. So let's, still on the Android side, we know we have a bitmap. We go to the Flutter engine and we say, hey, give us a texture to play with. Flutter gives us a texture. We tell the texture, hey, make yourself as big as our bitmap. And then we start doing some kind of Android-specific stuff. We create this thing called a surface, which wraps around the texture. The surface gives us a canvas, which, as you can imagine, is what you use to paint the texture. We fill it with white just to get a background color in case there are any little seams in there. And then we copy the bitmap through the canvas onto the texture. And at this point, through this Android code, we now have a texture sitting in the GPU that looks like a PDF page. Then we just have one step remaining to make this part work. We need to display that in our Flutter app. And it's as simple as using a texture widget. So there's already a widget for that. You just give it the ID of your texture. That's literally, it's a number like 0, 1, 2, 3. So whatever ID Flutter gave you when you asked for the texture, You just need to get that back to the Flutter side, shove it in a texture widget, and now we are then seeing PDF pages in Flutter. So we've made this one round trip. We've actually delivered some value at this point. We previously could render nothing, and now we can render PDF pages. But are we done? Well, even if we have a list of pages like this, let's imagine the app has this kind of viewport. We're looking at these pages through that black box. What happens when the user zooms in? Well, we know we're dealing with bitmaps. I mean, whether it's a texture or a PNG, it's still a bitmap. So when we zoom in, that means making it larger, and that means our PDF page just got really blurry. You might say, well, when the user zooms in, re-render that page at a much larger resolution. But it turns out that pretty quickly you'll exceed the maximum allowed bitmap size in Android, and then you can't make it any bigger. The user can't zoom in any further. So the problem we've arrived at here is essentially the same problem that systems like Google Maps deal with, which is what do you do when what you're rendering far exceeds the size of a single image? And that's when you implement a tile strategy. Take that one page, break it up into 4 tiles. Each of those tiles, in terms of pixels, are the same size as the original image, but they show 1/4 of the page, and then you stitch them together. And if the user keeps zooming in, then we'll go to a 1/16 of the page, and we'll stitch all those tiles together. And this gives us arbitrary zoom levels, keeping crisp text. But once we've implemented this concept of tiling, where we now need the concept not only of a document and a page, but also which tile on the page, we're going to end up requesting a whole bunch of tiles at one time, because one moment of what you're seeing on the screen probably involves 4, 6, 9 tiles. And so now we need a little bit more sophistication here. We need a request queue where we take all of the tiles that we've requested. We also have a paint cache, all the tiles that have been painted. And as we request these tiles over many pages, we're going to run out of memory. So we also need an eviction policy that says, okay, we need a new tile. We don't have any room left. We need to take a tile that we've already painted. We need to have some policy there to pull that back. But assuming that we've implemented all of that, then at this point, we've made it work. You can zoom in, you can zoom out, you can scroll any document, any page. Fundamentally, the problem is solved. And we move on to phase 2, which is make it fast. Now, fast, certainly that can mean reducing CPU cycles, that can mean reducing memory footprint, but really it means UX. Make it feel as fast as possible to the user, and I'll show you an example of that right now. Let's talk about tile load order or paint order. The order in which we find the tiles that we request, that we paint, tends to be from top to bottom, left to right, because typically that's how you lay things out. We have this scroll view that goes vertically, right? So we're starting at the screen origin, and we're finding content going down the screen, and we're just probably going left to right. That tends to be the convention, which means we paint the tiles in the order that you see here. Now, out of curiosity, can anyone see the problem with this paint order? Would anyone like to guess? Nobody has any idea? One in the back? So you said unnecessary tiles. Let's assume that all of these are visible. Let's assume that literally the viewport sees these tiles right here. So they're all necessary, but there's still a UX problem here. Pardon? How so? What, the white at the bottom? Okay, well, the colors are just a visual aid here associated with the number. So assume this is real PDF content that's not all black or all white, not going to hurt your eyes. He said wasteful tiles. Which ones are wasted? Sure, well, we can evict them once they go off screen. But even in this moment, this actual moment right here, we've created a problem for the user. Yes. The user is focusing on the center tiles, so you want to paint the center tiles first. That's what you said, and that's exactly correct. So one thing I guess I should have mentioned, but I didn't, is that it just so happens that Android can only paint one tile at a time. It's very stern language in the API docs that this is single threaded, you may paint one at a time, which means whatever order we paint in, that's the order that these things kind of flash onto the screen. And if we're starting at the top and going to the bottom, then the part that the user clearly cares about, which is 7, 8, 11, and 12, those are we don't get to those until we're halfway through. The user might be waiting there for seconds for those tiles to appear. And so really what we want is an order that looks like this. We want tiles to be painted based on proximity to the center of the viewport, because almost certainly that's where the user is focusing his or her attention. And this now means that in addition to the request queue, the paint cache, the eviction policy, the request queue itself needs to have priorities. And every frame, 60 times a second as the user is panning around, we're going to recompute the priorities of every request in that queue based on the proximity to the center of the screen. And again, this might sound minor. It made a massive difference. Once you're actually scrolling through a bunch of pages in a long document, it was literally the difference between multiple seconds and a fraction of a second in terms of what you perceive as a user. And then once we get to the point where we're updating request priorities in real time, I couldn't keep that in my head anymore, and there was no way we were going to log stuff to the console that was going to make any sense. So again, in terms of real world Flutter, we're building a solution on a solution on a solution. This was a good time to pause our product focus and actually build tooling for us to validate our own code. And so what you're seeing here in terms of the page experience, you see the thick blue lines in the PDF. Those are the tile boundaries. We can make sure that tiles are appearing when we expect them to and where they're being placed. And then over on the left, the really cool part is this kind of tile mini map, where for every zoom level, we are showing the current tile breakdown of that zoom level for this page. Green tiles represent painted tiles. Red are requests that are waiting to be painted. The black boxes represent tiles that are visible in the viewport right now. And then you probably can't see it, but there's a little orange rectangle that shows the viewport, and there's a blue rectangle which represents a caching region around the viewport. So now in an instant, we can visually verify all of these critical aspects in terms of, again, what have we requested, what's painted, what's being evicted, and when. But that was just one page. Even if one page works, you put 3 pages, 5 pages together, maybe they don't work together well. So we created a second kind of version of this tool, where this time we still have a mini map, but the mini map is not per zoom level, it's actually per page. So as we go up and down the document, we can ensure, okay, this page is supposed to paint and it is, this page is not supposed to paint and it isn't, but then we can start zooming in. And especially as we pan across page boundaries while we're zoomed in, we're again making sure that the right breakdown of tiles are happening on each page that's visible and not happening on pages that are well above and below the fold. So finally, stage 3, make it polished. So something you probably didn't see there because we'd already solved this by the time we recorded those videos, but if you think about going from one zoom level to another, where you break the tiles down into smaller pieces, if you truly just display those tiles that are broken down, again, they paint one at a time. And so what you would see for a moment is a completely white page, and then you'd watch all those tiles appear. And then you'd zoom in again, all white, and all the tiles would appear. So what we need to do to prevent that problem is to render the higher resolution tiles above the lower resolution. You remember that really blurry effect that we saw in the other plugin? That's because they had a low resolution tile that was always beneath their higher res tiles. The problem with that plugin is they were never loading anything outside the viewport. So any way you moved, you were stuck looking at that really pixelated, blurred version, and you weren't seeing the higher res. But we still need to layer it because even in our case, we need to wait for those tiles to render, even if it's quick. So we do something like this, the higher res, again, above the lower res. We also worked on fine-tuning some properties on momentum simulations. So we ended up with an experience where when we fling the pages, they scroll quite a bit further than the original plugin we looked at. And if you look very closely, if you ever experience it directly, when it comes to a stop, it's this kind of buttery, smooth, rolling stop, as opposed to this kind of jerky motion, which was present in other plugins. It's also present in the standard list view scrolling simulations in Flutter. So there's nothing we could use that gave us that smooth stop. We had to really fine tune those parameters. But again, as small as this is, It's something the user is going to feel pretty much every moment of the reading experience. So here's the result. Let's run the same two minor kind of tests that we saw from the original plugin. We'll do the fling scrolling. And again, it's kind of hard to remember what the last one looked like versus this one and see it on the screen. But when we really fling, we tend to go quite a bit further than the original plugin, which is important if your document has like 100 or 200 or 300 pages in it. And we're also getting a much smoother stop. And what you're not going to see here is any jank. You're never going to see the page suddenly stop and start or anything like that, because we've worked to really make sure that Flutter isn't doing too much work during layout or paint. But the place where we really shine is here in the zooming and the panning. You probably won't notice a single bit of blur on this screen from what you're watching. This is a night and day difference between that other plugin that we looked at. And so as best we can tell, this is now more performant in a UX perspective than the most performant plugin available on Pub. So we've at least accomplished that goal, and hopefully it's also good enough for our client. So conclusion, how do you build non-trivial things in Flutter? First, you go check Pub. If somebody's built something that you can use, go use it, configure it, move on to something that's useful. But if you have to build it yourself, then make it work, make it fast, make it polished. And I'll leave you all with just a few follow-ups here. So my team did this work for a company called Daylight. Actually, fun story. I met the CEO of Daylight at my first presentation at one of these meetups, Flutter Silicon Valley. It was downtown Palo Alto. He and I got to talking for a couple hours after that meetup. And a few months later, he brought my team in to help work on various things that they're doing at Daylight. I can't go into what those things are because they're still, they're still a stealth startup. But if you have an interest in solving complex Flutter problems, or even if you're a backend developer, data scientist, there may be some roles available for you. So reach out to hello@daylightcomputer. That's singular, daylightcomputer.com. Also, if you'd like my team to come and do what you just saw us do with that PDF renderer for your app, for your company, for your problems, head over to superdeclarative.com. You can reach out to me and we can help you with proprietary services. And lastly, the reason I'm dressed in such an awesome outfit here is because I'm chief of the Flutter Bounty Hunters, and we're an organization that exclusively works on open source Flutter and Dart packages. And the idea behind this effort is that lots of tools are necessary, but they are non-competitive. They're just things you have to build. So if your company would like my team to build those tools for you and for other companies, maybe share some funding to lower the cost to you, head over to flutterbountyhunters.com, reach out, and I'd love to talk with you. And I don't know what the timing is there, but I'm happy to take questions if anybody has any.
PDF viewer, is it on Pub?
Is the PDF renderer on Pub?
Yeah.
It's not currently because this was a proprietary contract. However, I will do my best to convince the client to let the Flutter Bounty Hunters open source that, because my opinion is, again, what we've built is necessary for their business, but they're not in the business of selling PDF renderers. So I prefer that other people not have to repeat all the work that we just did. Any other questions? Probably a couple. How long was it? Probably a couple months. Not full time. All right. Anything else? Any questions?
Yeah. Hi. So after how long did you decide that it was time for you to create your own, like a custom PDF render?
So how long did we spend searching Pub to see what was there? Yeah, I don't know what the duration was, but I literally put together a document where I listed essentially every plugin in the first 3 to 4 pages. And I did my best to jump into the source code and say, okay, what approach are they taking? I had to start generalizing a little bit, but pretty quickly it's obvious, like, oh, this is another plugin which uses the built-in Android renderer to paint bitmaps to send back over the channel. So pretty quickly I categorized what was available. And again, I picked the one that seemed to be the most likely performance implementation based on source code, and I just validated against that. But I'm not really sure how many hours or how many days that ended up being. Any other questions? Going once, Going twice. All right, thank you very much.